Have you ever had an experience that was so unbelievable that nearly everyone who hears the story is awestruck? If you only listen to one episode of this podcast, it should be this one.
Welcome to Faith Becomes Sight with Catherine Boyle. In this podcast, Catherine shares incredible stories of what happens when ordinary people put their faith in Christ. If you think God is distant and the Bible isn't relevant today, these stories will make you think again and discover that the passages, patterns, and promises from God and His Word are active and alive today. And now here's Catherine with today's episode.
Welcome to Faith Becomes Sight. So the short answer is yes. This podcast is about answered prayers in my life and others' lives, but it's more than that. It's to share the many incredible things that the Lord has done that show that specific passages, patterns, and promises in Scripture are true, and they're lived out in the lives of believers. Not just believers from a long time ago, but believers today, like me and like you. Hopefully, by hearing some of these stories, you'll see that He is working in your life too, and that Scripture is being lived out in what He's doing in and around you as well. These stories are to praise the Lord for the work that He's doing, not only what we see now, but what's going on behind the scenes too, before that work is seen, because this is really an important aspect of spiritual warfare and advancing His kingdom on earth. So for today's episode, I'm just going to tell the story straight through with no break. The scriptures that support this episode are both found in Luke 2, verses 19 and 51. Now, if you're hearing those references, you might have your memory jogged a little bit. You might be familiar with these passages, whether the reference or what they actually say. But both of them are about Mary pondering in her heart the things that were happening related to her son Jesus, first as an infant and then as a 12-year-old. I'm confident there were many other things that she pondered and reflected on throughout her life. Some things that she knew that she only understood poorly at best. I am in no way diminishing Mary's experience as a parent or comparing myself to Mary, Jesus' mother, but I am saying that the Lord sometimes gives us experiences that rock our world. So I welcome you to feel free to share this podcast. And if you're going to share one episode, I hope it will be this one, because this one's really special to me. So here goes. So our family had some pretty rough years, starting around 2013, 2014, through about 2017 through 2018. Now, we'd had big challenges before then, but it really just kind of felt like we were stuck in a hurricane for years. There were times when my husband and I literally prayed together on the altar at our church, not knowing which way we should go, which decisions we should be making. We just knew that we had an enormous challenge and we couldn't handle it on our own. And we just really didn't know what to do. We had wonderful friends that prayed for us and encouraged us. But there were many days, months, and really even an entire year where I cried in the shower almost every single day. I really tried to hide it from everybody else, but I could just let it go in the shower. Part of our struggles were related to getting the autism diagnosis for our son, which didn't come for him until early 2016 when he was 19. Now, you might be thinking, okay, why didn't they get that sooner? Well, that's a darn good question, because we saw, depends on how you count, but basically 14 different doctors and medical people and education specialists, all of whom could have just asked a question that might have led us to this answer much sooner. But what happened was I was the one who finally put it all together, and I was right. And that was quite hard going through that experience. Well, as part of getting this diagnosis, my husband and I began to talk about trying to find his biological family. My husband, Barney, was adopted at birth. In fact, his adoptive parents' names are on his birth certificate, not his biological parents. He was born in Florida in 1961, and I don't know what would happen today, but that's what happened when he was born. This adoption was already prearranged before he was born. So we learned that year in 2016 that his adoption had been filed through the court. It was a private adoption, so we really weren't sure. Things were different back then. There wasn't anything funny going on. Things were different back then. But we did find out that there was a court case. And so we petitioned the court to release his adoption record for medical purposes. We went back and forth with that several times. And when we finally got it, it was so redacted, it was useless. Think of the Epstein files. Everything is basically blacked out except for dear sirs or whatever at the beginning. So that's what we got back from the court. It was absolutely of no use. So there is an agency in Florida that helps connect adopted people to their biological families. And they were able to give us all the non-identifying information from the adoption record. That was all that they could release. We did learn that his biological parents were from a Midwestern state and that their ages were, that they were definitely teenagers when he was born. And so that confirmed what we had heard about his parents, their ages, but we never knew anything about what part of the country they might be from. So Midwestern state, that was something. So this nice lady who helped me recommended that we do ancestry DNA. I was really pretty skeptical because if you look at my husband, it's obvious he is of European descent, probably Irish or English or some combination. But we figured, okay, at least he can learn his specific ethnicity, if nothing else. So this was summer of 2016. And so he did the DNA test. You spit in the tube, we send it off. And then 6 weeks later, one day we open up an email and he has what Ancestry says is most likely a second cousin match. And so that was pretty staggering. Day one, he's got a match to somebody who has a family tree. And so I reached out to the person who was the owner of the tree, and Barney matched to this gentleman named Mike. And his wife, Diane, was the lady who did all the genealogical work. And so we knew that Mike was Barney's relative in some kind of way. And Mike and Diane had grown up in Western Ohio. So I was like, okay, so yeah, it could be, that's a Midwestern state. So Diane graciously shared her family tree with us so that we could try to figure out if there was anything helpful. You can do that in Ancestry, and I'm not going to go into all that. It's really helpful if you're not knowing what you're looking for. And so for Mike's family, one side of his family, the parents were much older than the other side of the family. And so it was pretty quickly obvious that the older side of the family just couldn't be, none of them could be one of Barney's biological parents as a teenager. And so that first day that I was looking at Diane's tree, I saw that one of Mike's aunts had actually died in a town in Florida that was really close to where my husband grew up. I figured she was from Ohio, and tons and tons and tons of people from the Midwest and Ohio retire to Florida. So I really didn't think twice about that. And Ancestry said that Mike and Barney were probably second cousin matches after all. So I started searching all of the second cousin matches to Mike and anything that was older just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And I'm really good at research. And so I began, based off of what Diane had shared with us, I began building out our own tree. And I did find somebody within a couple of months who somewhat matched. It was a little bit off, but not tremendously off. And so we mustered up our courage and sent a message to her and her husband, just telling them we were looking for medical information. And so they responded. They were very kind, but they said, no, this isn't her. This is some of the family that was hers, but maybe it's somebody else in this family that is your relative. And so it was kind of like starting over from scratch. So that was several months after we got the DNA results. And around that time, we had some unexpected family issues that just totally derailed any further searches or ancestry work for several months. And it really just knocked the wind out of my sails, so to speak. I had started a 501c3 mental health ministry about 15 months earlier. And this was when I met Dr. Steve Gersovich from Key Ministry and got connected there. Everything was going great with that ministry. And then suddenly, by necessity, everything ground to a halt. So this was late fall 2016 into early 2017. So by the time I was able to get back into this a little bit by early 2017, we had more matches that kept coming up and more second cousin matches, but the surnames were all different. So it was obvious to me that we had relatives on both sides of Barney's family. So relatives who were related to each of Barney's biological parents. Now, this was at a time too when I don't know exactly when peak time was for people doing DNA tests on Ancestry and 23andMe and those kind of sites, but we had new matches like every single day. It was wild. So I think this was probably about the peak of when people were really interested in doing this. So I knew just looking at all these matches that we had both sides of Barney's family represented, but I just couldn't figure out based on what Ancestry said, based on Diane's husband, Mike, being a second cousin match to Barney's parent, whichever one. So the first Saturday in February of 2017, I decided I was going back through everything. I was going to start from scratch and look at all those second cousins and go all the way back through fourth cousins just to see what I had possibly missed. Now, all the families were huge. 100 years ago and earlier, most families had no fewer than 3 or 4 kids. And so it was no small task to start, figuring out when people were born and if their kids could have been one of Barney's parents and just the whole thing. And so I went back from, second, third, and fourth generations on Mike's side. And I saw that, there was nobody I had missed. There was nothing I had missed. So at the end of the day, I'd been at this like all day long. It was like 8 o'clock at night. And so I just kind of prayed, Lord, I don't see what I'm missing. I have proven that all these people and their birth dates are not Barney's relative, Barney's biological parent or their relative. So there was just nothing lining up. So I didn't even really ask the Lord to help, but it was just kind of like, I don't know what to do. And so this thought just popped into my head. Why don't you check the first cousin matches to Diane's husband, Mike? And then the same thing with those other surnames. So I was like, oh, I hadn't even done that. So that person who died in Bradenton, who I saw that first day, that was Mike's aunt, his mother's sister. It turns out she was Barney's grandmother. Within 30 minutes after looking at these possible first cousin matches on both sides of the family, I found the high school yearbook for his parents because I had come up with two names. And within 30 minutes after this, I found their pictures and Barney looked just like both of his parents. Now, I had prayed and prayed and prayed from that first day when we had matches that when we saw pictures of these people, it was going to be obvious that Barney was their child. And boy, was it. I mean, there was just no question that he is absolutely their child. So, this was a big day. Well, within a few days, we learned that his biological father was still living, but we also learned that his biological mother had passed away. His biological parents did not marry each other. And pretty quickly, I learned the name of his mom's husband. And they were all from Ohio. They were all from Dayton, Ohio, which is in the western part of the state, kind of close to where Mike grew up. So that big search day was Saturday. And then the following Tuesday, I was working in a grocery store cafe. I often did this when I had to drive a kid somewhere that was far from home and it made more sense to just like camp out in a friendly cafe kind of environment than travel back and forth. I had done that kind of thing off and on for years, as long as we had kids basically in school. And I wrote an entire book and Bible study doing this very same thing. And it was in another location of this very same grocery store chain. So that day, I was, researching when my husband's biological mother got married and her husband, because I knew that she had gotten married when Barney was young, but I wasn't sure of the date. Barney was born in January of 60. I was just looking. I was curious to see when she got married and all that kind of detail. And so if you don't know, it is quite amazing how many records are online and accessible through sites like Ancestry. And so I pretty quickly found their marriage license. And then I just kind of sat there and stared in disbelief because they got married in August 1962 when Barney was 18 months old at a church 5 minutes from our house. Now, this might seem like a small thing at first, but I want you to listen carefully. These two people, Barney's mom and her husband, grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is more than 600 miles away from our Richmond, Virginia suburb. Now, I had documented where their their parents and all of the siblings and cousins had lived, and there was no one in either of their families who lived in the Richmond, Virginia area or anywhere in Virginia. So I literally closed that document, I refreshed my computer, and I searched again because I couldn't believe it could be the same people. I got the same result. I did this a third time. And I don't remember exactly, but I might have had to stand up and walk around because I could barely contain myself with what I was seeing. Now, there's a lot you don't know about the significance of this. I'm about to tell you. So, my husband and I got engaged in 1993, and we lived in one suburb area of Richmond. And he really wanted to move to this community that was about 10 minutes from where he worked, and it was about 20 minutes from where I was working at the time. Now, it was a very nice neighborhood, but it was on this opposite end of town from where we had lived, and there wasn't nearly as much there in terms of shopping and conveniences and that kind of thing. He wasn't adamant, but I just really had kind of a negative bias against it. I'll be honest about that. So one Saturday, he was playing golf, and I decided, you know what, I'm just going to drive down there and drive around. And I just remember praying, driving down the road that morning, Lord, if you really want us to live there, I just need peace about this. And driving around that day, I got it. I totally felt a sense of peace and purpose for that community for us. Now, it's really easy to say something like that or even pray and think that you get peace, but I actually knew that this was something that God had for us. I had that peace. We never even looked anywhere else after that. We had looked a couple other places, one other neighborhood, and we're talking about different areas, but never looked anywhere else after that. And a couple of weeks later, we actually found the lot where we ended up building our house. So when we found the lot, we had been looking at other lots in the community. And so we are driving around and we see this lot that had this beautiful circular driveway, paved driveway. There were brick posts on either side, on either end of the driveway. It's a circle. And there were all these really nice plants. It was kind of overgrown, but you could see that there was a lot of plants there. And it was just baffling. Where is the house? There obviously had been a house because you don't put all that kind of stuff in until the end or after the house is there. And so we reached out to the realtor and found out that a couple of years earlier, there had been this gorgeous house there and it had literally burned to the ground. Now, nobody had been home, thank goodness, at that time, but it ended up being this long, drawn out thing of trying to figure out what exactly happened, what was the cause before insurance would pay out. And it ended up being a wiring kind of issue in the house. And so in the process, the owners ended up buying another property and they didn't want to rebuild there after going through all of that. And so they had just put the lot on the market like the day before or a couple days before we saw it. And so, we got this property and pretty soon we started building our house. And so for years, we thought this was the big story because it's a cool story, right? And we kind of prayed about this. I did pray about this. And then bada bing, we found this lot with this story. But God must have just been chuckling up there, thinking, just you wait till you learn the real story. So back to Barney's mom. Not only did she get married at a church 5 minutes from our house, but she got married at a church where our next door neighbor went on staff at that church, like right around that same time. Now, we lived next door to that neighbor for 30 years. And that neighbor and her husband attended that church. They were members of that church. And I think our neighbor still is. And they're about the same age as Barney's mom and her husband. So Barney's mom gets married at this church that's 5 minutes from our house. And then she and her husband live in an apartment complex right down the street from that church And they lived in those apartments for 3.5 years until their first child, Barney's half sister, was born. And then shortly after that, they relocated to Detroit, Michigan for a job that Barney's mom's husband took. So, by the way, their apartment number at that apartment complex that's still there, their apartment number was the same as our house number, the house that we lived in for 30 years, just kind of wild. So our next door neighbor, we're telling her this, and she kind of freaks out because she had many friends who lived in this apartment complex at the same time as Barney's mom and her husband. And so it is almost a given that they cross paths at some time. That's not a huge complex. I mean, it's probably maybe, I don't know, 50 units, 60 units, and they were all the same age. Well, the reason they were living in this small town near Richmond and getting married in this church in this suburb near Richmond is that Barney's mom's husband, his name was Ed. Ed was drafted in the Army in the late 50s to an Army base in Petersburg, Virginia, which is below the community where we lived at a suburb of Richmond. So Ed served at that base for 3 years, and then he was discharged, and he got a job as a chemical engineer at Allied Chemical, which is now Honeywell. And again, he worked there for 3.5 years as a chemical engineer, and then they moved to Detroit. At the very same time that they lived in this town near Michigan, baby Barney visited Richmond several times with his adoptive mom. Why is that? Baby Barney is adopted in Florida. Why in the world is he coming to Richmond? Well, Barney's adoptive mom grew up in the city of Richmond, and her father and other relatives still lived there when Barney was growing up. So several times they traveled to Richmond, and Barney's biological mother, who was forced to give him up, was only 20 minutes away. There's an endless amount of detail to this story, and I'm going to share some of the big things in other episodes. But if you've listened to these podcasts, so you know that Barney grew up in Florida. I just told you, but he grew up in Florida, went to college in Florida. So how in the world did he end up in Richmond? Sit down for this. When he graduated from college, he moved first to South Carolina for work. And then a couple of years later, he was transferred to a small town near our house to work as a chemical engineer at Honeywell. You heard that right. The same job as his mother's husband, Ed. There were 3 locations that were real close to our house and real close to this little town where Ed and Barney's mom lived. Ed worked in that town, but these other 2 locations, Barney worked in one most of the time, but he went to the location where Ed worked plenty of times. And we know people whose parents worked in that same location as Ed at the same time, and no doubt interacted with him. So there is so much to this. And again, I'm going to be sharing some of the things that are just really meaningful to me in some future podcasts. So back to the verses for today about Mary pondering the things that God was doing. God didn't rescue me or my family from what was hard. That has never been the case. That was not the case in those really hard years. I had so many prayers in that time that were not answered the way that I prayed. And even though it was a really low time when we found this out, it wasn't the absolute worst day when we learned everything that I just described. So why did God give us this? I mean, this is just a treasure to me, and it is to Barney too. So I don't know 100% why he gave us this incredible gift, other than just to let us know, and anybody who hears this story know that he is doing so much more in our lives. He reaches so much farther into the future, and he redeems so much more from our past that we can't even really fathom the threads that he's tying together and weaving together. And the result of all this is really still being played out. Barney got to meet his biological father and his dad's lovely wife and 2 half sisters on that side. And unfortunately, his dad passed away several years ago, but we did get to see him several times before that. And we've been able to meet Barney's half brother and half sister on his mom's side. And Ed passed away before their mom. So in some ways, it was much easier to connect with them because Barney's mom and Ed had already passed on. We eventually connected to a cousin who was on Barney's dad's side, and she knew some things she didn't realize that she knew. Barney was a secret in 2 families, and when the 2 families learned about Barney, suddenly those secrets made sense. And so what's really clear to me is that Barney's biological parents didn't want to give him up, but they were high school students and they were not ready to be parents, and for sure not with each other, or not at that time. And their parents made this plan to send Barney's biological mom and her mother, Barney's grandmother, to Florida. They had already regularly vacationed down there. And so they decided that's where his mom would go and that they would find a family to adopt him. And that's exactly what happened. Barney's mom saw an OBGYN in Tampa, and he arranged the adoption with Barney's adoptive family. Barney's adoptive father was an OBGYN in another Florida city, and these two doctors were friends. Barney's adoptive family had tried to have a child for years without success, so they adopted him. And then they later had a biological daughter, which happens all the time. Interestingly, both sets of Barney's grandparents retired close to where he grew up, and we will never know if they knew who adopted him, but there sure is a lot of strong circumstantial evidence that they could figure it out, even if they didn't know for sure. And, I'm confident that's not the reason why they both retired to Florida, but I do find it a little curious for sure. So as we moved through the rest of that year in 2017, and we started forming these new relationships with Barney's biological family, and I just remember being mostly in awe, just kind of letting things unfold in the Lord's timing. When I was young, I had been pretty impatient, but I had definitely learned by then, most of the time anyway, that it's absolutely best to just wait and to see what God is doing. We could have done this search years earlier for similar health related reasons, but we didn't. And we did this at a time when the future was far from certain in our family. And I consider this a compounded kind of miracle. And in that, God really just spoke loudly that he was with us, that he had been, and he was still going ahead of us. And that by taking the narrow path with him as we had for all those years, that he gave us this incredible gift, this thing that we could see that he did, that only he could have done. If we had turned our back on him through all the challenges, we would have never received this gift that he gave. I've read somewhere that the truth is always there. It's just waiting to be revealed. And that was absolutely true in this case. It was truth that was literally hidden in plain sight. Well, in this experience and in so many others, the Lord has shown that this is just real, that, he has his truth there and we just get to discover it. And when I stay close to him, I get this joy. We get to live out the discovery and living out he is working his promises, his patterns, and his passages in his word in my life and in your life and in the life of every believer. Well, I'm going to wrap up now. As I mentioned, there are many smaller stories within this big story, and I'll be sharing some of those in upcoming episodes through this summer. So if you would like to share a story with me, or if there's something that you'd like to share as a result of hearing this podcast, I'd love to hear that. You can email me at faithbecomessight@gmail.com. That's sight, SIGHT, and that's faithbecomes, 2 S's in the middle, sight@gmail.com. So thank you for being here, for listening, for liking or following, subscribing to the podcast and the social media channels. And thank you for sharing too, especially this episode. This one is very dear to my heart. So I'll be back soon with another incredible story that showed me that with God, that even my tiny little bit of faith can become sight, because he is far bigger than I can imagine. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Faith Becomes Sight. Be sure to subscribe to this channel, share this episode on your social media, and leave a 5-star review. If you have your own experience of faith becoming sight, reach out to us on our social media channels for the opportunity to share your story. And remember, the Lord loves to respond to the prayers of his people, and there's nothing like seeing your faith become sight.